Hi, everyone. So it's a beautiful, blustery day in the state of Minnesota. We have a 26 degrees with 20 to 40 mile per hour winds going on right now. So it's a perfect day to kind of like seat ourselves inside and do some hand embroidery. Okay. So for those of you who are taking this lesson and have logged on to this workshop, the idea here is we are going to learn a brief bit about the history of embroidery. Then we're going to talk more in depth about the kind of origins of the Hmong story cloth. And then we are going to learn 6 basic stitches and hopefully get started on our own story cloth. Okay, so that's the plan for the day. So if that's not what you signed up for, that's then too bad because that's what we're doing here. All right, so I've got my Midwest shirt here representing, especially on this lovely cold day here in Minnesota. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started here by sharing my screen and presenting some lovely material here to you. Okay. All right. So as this states, we're going to look at a brief history of embroidery and specifically looking again at the Hmong story cloth. Now, for those of you who watched the Summer Olympics this last year, you probably are familiar with the name Suni Lee, who is one of the gymnasts from the Olympic Games who won the gold medal in the all around. That was a big deal for us here in Minnesota, and we were very, very excited. But she also happens to be one of probably the few Hmong athletes known around the world. And she really brought that kind of first and foremost to people's consciousness. I've taught in a few different states and have not seen that people really know this culture or have been introduced to this culture many times before. Okay. I actually grew up in Wisconsin and worked most of my life here in Minnesota. And so I was constantly surrounded by this culture. I grew up with my elementary school and middle school and high school cultural days, eating Hmong food, watching Hmong dance, and kind of hearing the instruments that they played during our Hmong celebrations. And these were our friends, our neighbors, our colleagues. So this was something that I grew up with. And the Hmong story cloth could be found kind of everywhere in the area that I grew up and all around here. So I felt like it was an important thing for us to kind of get some of that word out there and help kind of bring this art to life. So this project is actually one I am actually the assistant professor of art education at St. Cloud State University in Minnesota. And it's one I actually do with my class that's called Folk, Ethnic, and Indigenous Art Forms, so that students can sort of get to know a few just like non-traditional art forms during their art, like the content that they take in during their university experience. And so this was one of the ones I wanted to bring forward because I have quite a few Hmong students who come through the program, and they are going to have quite a few Hmong students in their programs as well. So this is probably on every evaluation I get for that class, the most popular project we do every semester. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started here with a little bit of history about embroidery. Okay, so embroidery is one of the oldest art forms that exists in human art making history. We've been doing it since needle and thread has been used by mankind. There's actually, as you can see, kind of fossilized remains of embroidery and stitch work and decorative clothing and things like that as far back as 30,000 BC, which is a little crazy to think about. It's been found throughout history across like every continent except Antarctica, over every different culture. Cultures as far back as ancient Egypt, the Babylonians, and even the Phoenicians were using this art form. It was kind of first seen as a storytelling device in the Tang and Song dynasties of China, where they would kind of keep record of history using this particular art form. And then later, this practice was adopted by the Europeans as the art form tended to kind of grow and spread across the planet worldwide, obviously. And probably the most famous version of storytelling using embroidery is the biotapestry that most people are aware of that depicts the Norman invasion of 1066 and is arguably the most famous embroidery in art history. Okay, so that's just a brief idea of how
embroidery sort of got started. So really everyone does it. It's a worldwide pursuit. Everyone really likes it, and it's still extremely popular today. And so because of that, I thought we need to kind of give more credence to this lovely art form. Okay. So the Hmong Story cloth itself has sort of a different story and kind of a very unique story. And so I really wanted people to understand where this art form came from. So it's a much more lesser known embroidery craft itself that was originally created by the Hmong people to keep record and history of their journey, specifically from Vietnam and Laos to America and other countries around the world. But there's a lot more to this story. So the Hmong have been embroidering for centuries, and that isn't something new, but the Hmong story cloth is a very unique part of their history because of how it sort of originated, okay? So it's unique to the Hmong who were forced out of their homes and became refugees shortly after the end of the Vietnam War. So here's what happened. So during the Vietnam War, actually, the American CIA recruited the Hmong culture to become part of a secret alliance to help fight against the communists in Laos and in North Vietnam. During that time, they, worked as allies and was kept under cover and sort of secret, but that secret later came out, okay? Once the Americans left the Vietnam War, they left the Hmong sort of defend for themselves. And one of the communist leaders, Pathet Lao, as you can see here, basically announced plans to wipe out the Hmong from Laos and Vietnam in those areas. And so they started bombing and burning the villages that were homes to the Hmong in these areas, okay? So the Hmong people were forced to flee and make a really treacherous journey into Thailand, where they could be basically awaited in camps, refugee camps, where they would then be relocated to other countries throughout the world. Some stayed in Thailand, but others were relocated to other countries throughout the world. As part of this, they had to actually cross the Mekong River, which was a pretty treacherous journey where many actually drowned and were killed during this particular flight from their homes. And I think one of the most tragic parts of this is they really had to be quite quiet and secretive in their journey across this Mekong River and across the jungles and things, so that they wouldn't draw attention to themselves. And one of the biggest things when I first learned about this as a child was the thing that stuck into my head was that they had to actually quiet the babies by drugging them with things like opium so that they wouldn't cry in the middle of the night. So it's kind of a very tragic story, as you can see, that the Hmong had to deal with this forced migration and to become refugees in a completely different country. And as you can imagine, most of them had to leave all of their wealth, all of their possessions behind to make this journey as quickly and as secretively as they could. And so they were pretty destitute once they hit the refugee camps in Thailand. And so the missionaries there noticed the, amazing artisan work of the Hmong embroiderers and encouraged them to start making pieces that they could sell once they were settled in places like America, which is one of the large areas that took them in after they were relocated. So it's kind of this is why the Hmong story cloth is very unique to this population. They've been embroidering for centuries, but the Hmong story cloth is sort of this weird amalgamation between what the missionaries thought American audiences would like to see and look at. And so the missionaries are sort of credited with saying, no, some of those bright colors that we see on the majority of your guys's regalia and clothing is a little too bright. American audiences don't really like that. They prefer a much more muted palette and color tones. And so the dark blues, the browns, the kind of taupes and beiges that are the backgrounds for story cloths were suggested by the missionaries themselves as a more palatable color palette for American audiences to be interested in buying the pieces. Like I said, traditional Hmong garb has always been extremely brightly colored. It's actually known as flower cloth, which you'll learn about in just a second here, and is completely different than the Hmong Story cloth. So this is a very interesting thing, that these really well-known pieces of Hmong art and art history now have really kind of blossomed from this really unfortunate situation. And this is an example that we see here in this very large version of a story cloth, okay? So the tradition continues here. Since the Hmong had no written language until about the 1950s, most of their history had been passed down orally and through their art. So the Hmong story cloth continued this tradition by depicting scenes of their journey as they fled from their homelands. And that became the subject of most of the story cloths that are best known today and have been kind of regarded as pieces of art history. So they richly decorated these tapestries with a wonderful narrative filled with tons of detail about this treacherous journey that they had to make. One of the key characteristics that you'll see in most of these story cloths is the crossing of the Mekong, which you can see depicted in this last one here, in this lovely, like, contrasted embroidery work in the middle. And you can see it here where they're actually kind of using flotation devices to help get them across and over the river itself. So these pieces, though, involve embroidery in an extremely intense degree, but also, as you can see, applique and sort of quilting techniques as well, that help make these very unique to their culture. But don't just take my word for it. You know, I'm a strong believer in first person accounts of things. And so this is a great video that we can watch that has some first person accounts of how the Hmong kind of came to, how the story cloth came to be.
The art of Hmong needlework involves more than cloth, applique, and color. It is a learned art, an art of storytelling. And theirs is a story that dates back to the early 1800s. It was around that time that the Hmong people migrated from China to areas in Laos, Thailand, Burma, and Vietnam. After the Vietnam War, the Hmong people living in Laos fled to refugee camps in Thailand. As camps were closed, many refugees immigrated to the United States and other countries. The transition into a new place was difficult, and since the Hmong people did not have a written language until the 1950s, they expressed themselves in other ways. Needlework and folk art became the canvas on which their culture could be shared and seen.
Anything that we wear as clothing is a form of art. As little as the baby carrier, there's art on it, there's cross stitch, applique on it, or as a baby's hat, it's applique, and especially the baby's hats. There's a lot of work that's put into it. There's a lot of symbolic meanings. The most popular is the elephant's footprint. That's what we use on most of our design as clothing and as decorations. And behind that elephant's footprint, within that design, there's so many little designs in it. It's the elephant footprints itself is also called snail shells that's put into it too.
For the Hmong, the elephant footprint symbolizes the importance of a close-knit family. Much like a herd of elephants, they find strength in living together and helping one another. Other designs and shapes featured in their textiles are thought to be characters that once made up their ancient written language. Over time, due to persecution and cultural genocide, the characters have become indecipherable and are now simply designs. Hmong women create special garments to celebrate life events like weddings, funerals, and births. The Hmong refer to the techniques used to create the clothing as padao, meaning flower cloth. It's a process that takes years to learn because it involves applique, cross-stitching, batik, and embroidery.
Hmong story cloth, you can go anywhere in the United States where Hmong people live and still see story cloths that look like the same, because Hmong people, they live in village, they live in tribes. They usually do, they garden a lot. They live by nature. And a lot of you see is the Vietnam War, because a lot of Hmong went through the Vietnam War and crossing the river from the Vancouver River to Thailand to a refugee camp to come to the United States. And a lot of Hmong, they can't really speak English. The older generation, they can't really speak English. So the only thing they can show their emotion and show their feelings are through story cloth.
It's very important to the Hmong, and also in try to express where they came from, who they are, and where they're heading. It's so important because Hmong did not have a written language until in the early 1950s. And in order to communicate and express who they are, where they're from, and how much hardship they've gone through to get to where they are, they would tell a story. Particularly the elders would tell an old story, and the younger generation or the younger children will try to draw. And after drawing it, they will try to do a stitchery work, making that into a story cloth.
Today, the Hmong people strive to tell a different story. It's not just one of where they have come from, but rather where they have been and where they are going. It is a story of family and strength, of life and love. While they use their traditional skills as a way to share new experiences, they have not forgotten their roots. As we embrace their craftsmanship, we too can become a part of this preservation and open the door to a greater understanding of people outside of our own culture.
Right now, all the art is dying out. The older generation's the only one that's doing it. That's over 50 years old that's doing it. They carry the art over after the war, or still from Thailand or from Laos.
Our generation, we still know people live in Laos and Thailand. We still know people that came from Laos and Thailand, like my parents does and my grandparents does. And if it passed through us, like I was born in the United States, I can't tell anything about my kids, one day, hey, this is how Laos looked like, this is how, I crossed the Mekong River and stuff. We can't tell them no more because we don't know any of the stories. So we should preserve our story cloth. We should preserve everything, because our story cloth have a point. That's the only thing that we can turn back to, show to our kids one day that, hey, this is what we got to the United States. Your grandparents came from this to this to this to the United States.
All right. So as you can see here, this would be the time that I would probably ask questions like, okay, what surprised you about that? What did you learn? And hopefully you took some of those kind of key pieces away, that this is a really important art form for preserving their history and allowing kind of the older generations to communicate with English speakers once they were settled here in America about what happened, and keeping that story alive. It's not a story that often gets told about there being allies with the American CIA. I know I certainly didn't hear that until I was quite a bit older and knew that part of it. But the students that I've had in my classrooms who have come through this particular unit talk about the fact that, there's this secret war that their families talk about every day when they're talking about their history, or speaking to their grandparents and things like that about how things were, and it's very real and a large part of their childhoods and how they grew up and the perspective they bring to life every day. So that's something that needs to be preserved, as one of the interviewers said here. So just to sort of give you a little bit more history too, as I said, it even showed Minnesota on that little map in the video as one of the places that they were relocated. And this is a huge part of the culture that exists here. Every student has had fellow classmates and have had Hmong in their classrooms, have had Hmong as colleagues. We've all been friends and neighbors with Hmong people for just a long time now. This is a huge part of our culture here in Minnesota. In fact, according to the Minnesota Historical Society, about 66,000 Hmong live in the Twin Cities metro, which is just an hour southeast of St. Cloud. And it's by far the largest concentration of Hmong in the United States. So these are the students that my students are going to have in their classrooms. And I think it's a really important thing for them to know at least a little bit about this culture if they haven't had the chance to before. Okay. And one of the ways that we can do that is through this particular art form. But you could see that they also kind of landed in places like North Carolina, California, and actually there's a large population in Kansas as well. So there are populations of Hmong spread throughout the United States. And it just so happens that we have a very vibrant piece of their culture here in the Midwest. So I just wanted a chance for you to really kind of appreciate how detailed and intensely decorative these pieces are. They feel as like a huge swath of this cloth to tell the story and to make sure that no detail is sort of left untold, to just how treacherous this was. If you start to kind of dig deeper into this, you can see kind of their homes in the mountains, where they were originally coming from. You can see soldiers in here, you can see the camps and where they were forced to be, and then of course the airports, which eventually land them in new locations. And of course that key feature of the Mekong River, which is always going to come into play here. But you also see a real glimpse into the life that they had before they came here, to the gardens, the growing, the agriculture. That was a huge part of who they are. That's a huge part of who they still are today. Our farmers markets are consistently filled with absolutely most delicious food grown by the Hmong farmers and agriculturalists around here as well. Here's a chance to see a really detailed look at just kind of the fine stitchery work that goes into this, the embroidery details that we see here, the overlapping of stitches and things like this little rooster that we see up top here. And you get a really interesting look into their way of life, what they were doing, how they were kind of living before they came here, and what a difference it must have been to be forced to leave that way of life and then come and land in the Midwest. Here's just another version. I like to show a few versions of story cloths. So you can see that, of course, every artisan sort of tells the story in a different way and shows different parts of life. So the main subject matter of many story cloths is that migration, that forced migration from their homes and to refugee camps, and then here eventually to the United States. But that's not all of them. Some of them are really meant, they are a storytelling device. They are a narrative device. So for this one, it's more about kind of celebrating the different cultural aspects and the rituals and things like that, that people go through in terms of stages of life. So you get to see all sorts of stories told with these story cloths. Once again, a chance to see just another kind of story. As the narrator in the video kind of at the end started to say that these story cloths have become more about a story of hope and where the Hmong are going as opposed to where they've been. So these story cloths, they don't stop. They haven't stopped doing them. This needlework has continued and this art form has still continued. It's just evolving. Okay, and another chance to really look at the stitching work. The one on the bottom right here, you can really see the detail in the work and how intricately they treat these. And it's literally like drawing with needle and thread. All right, so now it's our turn to learn some, basic embroidery stitches. And again, these are embroidery stitches that are used throughout the world. And obviously have been used in these story cloths themselves. I chose these because they're the most commonly seen and probably easiest way to tell a story with these particular kinds of needlework. So we're going to learn 6 basic stitches here. Here are the first 3. So the first 3 are the running stitch, which as you can see is it's exactly how it sounds. It's just an alternating stitch that goes in and out and up and down throughout the piece, looking like it's skipping or running along, hence the name, right? Then we have the back stitch. This one's pretty simple. It starts with a basic running stitch to start. Then you pop forward and then you actually go back into the last hole of the original stitch, and you do that over and over and over. This is a fantastic outline stitch, really good for edge work, things like that. And then the satin stitch, this is your basic fill stitch. So if you've kind of outlined an object or want to create some bulk or volume to an image, you're going to use a satin stitch. And so you see that that one utilized in the Hmong Story cloth quite a bit. These are lots of back stitch, lots of satin stitch represented in these. And then the 3 more stitches, these are again commonly used and kind of a bit more decorative, these last 3. The stem stitch, which is kind of a looping stitch that sort of overlaps and twists around. So you actually start with a stitch and then you run your needle through a loop. And so it creates this kind of beautiful looping effect. Stem stitch is a really common one in Hmong Story cloths. The split stitch is another one. This one's pretty simple. Again, it's like a back stitch, but when you go back, you actually pierce through the floss itself, and it creates this sort of like chain-like look. This just gives a little more bulk and I guess volume to a single stitch. I've seen this one used a lot in like the natural objects they show, like the plant life that they're putting in imagery into like the garden work and the agricultural scenes. You see a lot of the stem stitch and split stitch used because it looks more plant-like. And then the French knot, and this is exactly what it looks like. It's a really decorative small knot. This is good for like eyeballs or flowers and things like that to kind of make it look again very plant-like once again. Okay, so if we look back, we can sort of see some of these things coming out. So here's actually a stem stitch used. This one's outlined in the stem stitch. This is, it looks like a back stitch probably here. We've got just kind of regular back stitching here, but filling with satin stitch in a lot of these spots. Okay. We see eyeballs that are made with either a single stitch, or in some cases you can see French knots being used for those as well. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started and begin here. So if you could grab the felt and needle and floss that you might have available. If you don't have it, that's fine, but I'm going to highly recommend that you grab that. So I'm going to go ahead and end this show, and I'm going to switch over from here into my doc cam so that we can actually do this together. Okay. Perfect. Okay. So we're going to start by looking at this, and I want to make sure I'm going to really quickly unmirror so this makes more sense. Okay, cool. All right, now everything looks correct and you can read this. Okay. So I've got this little piece here that you can see. So you can embroider on almost any fabric. Some is just easier than others. So this is just a basic linen fabric that I happen to have left over in my classroom that I show it on every now and then. And I use this when I've got an actual physical hoop. So you don't need a hoop to embroider. It just makes life a little bit easier. So I'm going to demonstrate today just using a piece of felt because it's nice and thick and fairly stiff, and you can embroider right onto it. But if you've got something like a coat or a piece of jeans or something like that, something thicker, you don't necessarily need a hoop. But if you've got something thin like a piece of linen, you'd want a hoop. Okay, so I'm going to not demonstrate on the hoop like I said today. I'm going to just set that aside, but I'm going to have this sort of handy so we can keep looking at it. So the first one we're going to do together is our running stitch. So I want you to just get a good look at that. It's really simple and sweet. Nothing scary about this one, hopefully. Okay. So here's an example of some floss that we have. I tried to pick colors that really contrasted decently well, so you'd be able to see this really easily. This is pearl cotton. It's really soft cotton. That's going to be the stuff that I have at my actual in-person workshop for students to work with. You can get much cheaper floss. So if you're doing this in your classroom, for instance, you can absolutely get like big packs of floss that are like $20 for like 150 skeins. It's really cheap. But I will warn you that if you use that, you tend to get a lot more knotting. So I did this I started this one, and you can see it just starts to knot up on itself quite a bit. I don't know if it's the nature of it being more often made with polyester rather than cotton. It just tends to get really staticky and twists on itself a lot and becomes a problem. Okay. So I'm going to use the pearl cotton today. That tends to be a little nicer. I might still get a knot. I probably will because I'm trying to record this, right? That's always how it goes. So I'm just going to take enough to do these 6 basic stitches that you see here. Okay. So just grabbing a little bit, cut off with the scissors. And we're going to thread our needle. So if you've never threaded a needle, like an embroidery needle, and I'll show you the embroidery needle here too, so you can see it. It's a much thicker needle with a larger eye. It's got to pierce through usually thicker kinds of fabric. Things like linen isn't terrible, but things like denim and even this felt is going to be easier with a slightly bigger, thicker needle. So this is sometimes referred to as a tapestry needle or a hand embroidery needle. Okay. So when I'm threading this, I don't use the end. I actually flip it over like this, and then get it nice and tight in your fingers, and you just push that through. Of course, it's not going to go perfectly the first time I do it in a demonstration on a video. Do it hundreds of times before and it goes perfectly, but not today, of course. Okay, so you can see then you just push that through, leaving a nice tail for yourself, and you're going to have plenty of room to work with. Also, always knot the back. I tend to do a double knot by just folding over the end and then knotting it like this. I just tend to find if you've got a fabric that you're using that tends to have a thicker weave with more holes and things in it, even with linen, sometimes this can happen, and especially with felts, you need a thicker knot at the end, like you can see here, just a thicker knot at the end that will allow it to not come through. Okay, so we're going to start with that running stitch again. So once again, take a look. This is our running stitch that we're going to do. So I'm going to just start on the end of my felt here, and it's going to be really simple. I'm going to hold the felt nice and tight, pull my needle through until I hit my knot. And we are just going to make a stitch, a single stitch here, pulling it through, okay, until we've got that lovely single stitch. Now that single stitch is the basis for every other stitch that we are going to do today. So hopefully that part goes fairly easily for you. Okay. So this is some nice slippery cotton. So it slipped right off my needle and I had to rethread it. Now the idea behind the running stitch is to try to stay fairly even. So have the same sort of space between each stitch as each stitch actually takes up itself. So I'm just going to do a few of those, and you can go ahead and watch and get that done as well. Okay, so go ahead and take a peek. I'll let you catch up before I keep moving on. Get a few in there, get some good practice in. If you're really confident with this before we move on. Okay. For those of you who are familiar with embroidery, you've probably in the past been able to separate your thread a little bit, and I'll show that really quick too. So embroidery floss is something that you can easily like separate the threads on. I'm keeping mine intact so you can see this really nicely, but if you wanted to make thinner, more detailed areas on your cloth itself, you could actually just go ahead and separate those so you can elongate the life of your floss and actually make finer, more intricate detail with it. Okay, so we're just going to do a few here. Okay, 3 running stitches, very simple, very sweet. That's our running stitch. Okay, so the next one we're going to do is the back stitch. This one's really simple again. This one's great for outlines, for edges, for anything that you might want to do. It's fast, it's simple, and it can be really, really straight. Actually easier to create a straight look than with a running stitch. And it's going to start the exact same way we just did with the running stitch. So we're going to go right underneath this one here, and we're going to just make a single stitch, just like our running stitch here, okay, into our felt. So go ahead and do that right away and get your single stitch made, okay? Now here's where it changes just slightly. You are going to do the same thing you did before and kind of pop forward a whole stitch length, okay? But we want to fill that space now. And so this is why it's called the back stitch. You go back. And so we're going to go back into the last hole of our first stitch. Boom. Okay, I'm going to do that again. Hop a stitch forward, come up and go back into the last hole of our previous stitch. There you go. I'm going to do a few more of those. So for those of you who are still watching, pop up about a stitch forward, pull it through, and go into the hole of our previous, the last hole of our previous stitch. Very simple, very sweet back stitch. Okay. A few more just to get the hang of it. So as you can see, this one goes very fast. You'd outline that edge very quickly. So ends up looking really nice, super simple to do. Okay. So the next one here is our satin stitch. And this one's really easy to do. It's exactly what it looks like. It's a fill stitch. But in order to like practice it properly, I like to actually put a little guidelines, a couple of guidelines, so that I just have something to shoot for. So I'm just going to kind of put that in with some permanent marker for you to be able to see. If you are drawing your narrative later onto this, your little story for your story cloth, you'd have pencil lines that you'd probably fill in, or this might actually already have been done in a back stitch or a stem stitch or something like that. So you'd have an outline stitch in here, and then you'd fill in between those. And so it is as simple as it sounds. You just take that needle and thread and you go up and backward and forward. And you always want to come back again to the place you started before and try to get right up next to it as close as you can. Okay, for the next stitch here. So I'm poking through. It's exactly how it sounds. It's easy as it looks. Going right next to it. Okay. So like I said, this is a fill stitch. So this one takes a while to do. And you just keep going until it's fully filled. You try not to pull too hard. If you pull too hard on this, what you're going to start to see is it start to bunch in like this one did versus stay nice and even. So you do have to be somewhat careful with how you pull your pole cotton or your floss through. Okay. Just going back and forth. Filling that in. Beautiful, right? So we can start to see how it would fill very quickly and easily. The nice thing about embroidery is it's really forgiving. So if you've got a spot here that didn't feel like it filled properly, go back in and fill it, right? Like there's nothing to stop you from fixing that issue, okay? Look at that, beautiful. So it had a funny space, now it no longer does and looks really nicely filled. All right, so next up, we're gonna do our stem stitch. So this one you can sort of see, I'm trying to get a close-up look, see if you can, to allow you to see that it's a very twisting, knotting sort of look to it. So this one requires just a slightly more complex hand. And so I'm gonna let you guys kind of watch this, make sure we have a good focus now. Okay. So again, this is gonna start, as most of them have, right, with a basic first stitch. Okay, so we're just going to make a basic first stitch, but we're not going to pull it all the way through. We're going to leave a little loop. That's really important for this one. So we're going to leave a loop here, and then we're going to come back right up through the middle of where that loop would be, or where that stitch would be, and we're going to pull it. Okay, and that's going to help us create that kind of looping look, because now they're going to start to overlap. So once we have it here, we're going to bump about half a stitch forward, okay? So about half a stitch forward, and I might come a little closer so you can see it. About half a stitch forward here. I'm going to bring it through, and I'm going to leave a little loop. You always want the loop to go the same way. So if you started on the left, always go left. If you started on the right, always go right. And now I'm going to come up right in the last hole of our previous stitch. So it's sort of like a combination of a back stitch and this kind of stem stitch that we have. And you can see it's starting to loop already. So I'm going to move half a step forward again. Keep that loop there. I like to use my thumb for that. And come back up through the previous stitch, pull tight, and look at how lovely that's already starting to come out. Okay, half a stitch forward. Sorry, I went way more forward than I was anticipating. Okay, so you can see there, that's nice. And if you want to just finish that, you'll go through one more time and it'll create that last little loop. Okay, good. Sorry, I'm getting a bunch of emails. You're probably hearing all of my emails coming through. Apologize about that. All right, so the next one we're going to do is our split stitch. Okay, let's see if I can get a better look at that too. So the split stitch, still don't like that. That's better. Okay, so for the split stitch, this is exactly how it sounds. You're going to make a back stitch and then you're going to kind of go back into it and split right through the floss, and it creates that kind of decorative look to it once again. So it's pretty simple, but we want to go ahead and show you how to do it. Okay, so you're going to start by making, once again, a regular old running stitch. Okay, so make a nice small stitch here to get started. Okay, so once again, this is just a single stitch, and we're going to bring it forward about half the size of our stitch. Okay, so trying to only go about halfway over. Then we're going to pull that through, and then we're going to back stitch, but split through our original stitch. Okay, boom, very pretty, right? Going about half a step forward again. And then we're going to split through our original stitch. Back there. Pretty, pretty. Okay. Go up again. Split down the middle. Oops, got my cloth stuck in there. All right, and you can see how it's just starting to split and make this really pretty look. Again, if you want to finish that stitch off with a last split, you'll come through up through that same last hole, split through that stitch right there. Yep, and you'll finish it off. Sorry, I got a little stuck there. There we go. Okay, so pretty, right? Very simple, very sweet. And that brings us to our sixth and final piece, and that's the French knot. So I want you to see that it's really important how you hold the string, because if you don't hold the string, you get a very loose French knot. If you hold the string nice and tight, you get a very tight French knot. And I'll sort of show you what I mean here. So the French knot is very fun, but it's a pain to do it if you don't do it right. So for this one, you're going to start underneath again. You're going to pull up and through. And this almost requires like 3 hands to do this. So I apologize in advance. Okay, so you're going to take the string, you're going to wrap it around your needle twice. Okay, once, twice. And then you're going to bring that needle and thread through the same hole that you just went through. Now, here's what I mean by holding it tight. So I'm holding it really tight with my fingers over here, keeping it tight until the last minute. So I get a nice little cute knot. Okay, watch it again. Coming up and through. I'm going to move this tail just a bit. Then I'm going to wrap the thread around twice, once, twice. Okay. And then while it's still on there, I've got to poke back through the same hole. I'm holding nice and tight, pulling on my thread until the very last minute. And I get these beautiful little French knots, very small, very tight. If you don't hold, let me just sort of show you what can happen. Well, it might work. We'll see. Wrap it around twice. Once again, once, twice, I'm gonna poke it through here to that original hole. And now I'm not gonna hold on to it. Okay, so see how the whole knot just loosens up. It's just not as pretty. So if you like that look, that's fine, but it can start to knot up really soon and that can be problematic. So the tighter you hold your string, the kind of nicer the knot looks. Okay, one more time. Gonna hold this, wrap around twice. There we go. Once, twice, poke in, holding nice and tight to our string. Lovely little French knot. Okay, so now you've done the 6 main stitches here. Okay, we've got our running stitch, our back stitch, our satin stitch, our stem stitch, our split stitch, and our French knots. Okay, they'll look real pretty now. Very nice. Cool. So like I said, you can really use a hoop and do it on any fabric, but this is just basic old felt that you get from like Blick, right? When you order it online. So if you wanted to now, this is when you'd be able to just start out kind of like planning out what do you want in your piece. So I am hoping for some sun, right? Because it has been nothing but dreary and dull this spring here in Minnesota. So maybe I'll draw myself a cute little narrative here of kind of springtime and the flowers blooming, right? And I'd be able to draw right on this. You can do it with pencil, you can do it with marker, however your little heart desires, and you'd start to fill that in. So this was my first springtime piece. I can't wait for the trees in my front yard. I've got some pretty crab apples and things that make just these gorgeous pink blossoms in the spring. And it really kind of makes me think of spring when I see that. So I've started out doing just a bunch of French knots, as you can see here. And then kind of an alternating set of, this is actually just back stitching to fill, to create kind of a more intricate looking set of tree bark. Okay. I'll show you a couple of student examples really quick too. So this is one that a student let me keep. So this one is about the fact that she kind of feels like a god whenever she brings out the doggy treats for the 3 dogs that she has, which she kind of describes as her whole world, is how much she loves those dogs. But when she brings out the treats, that is her whole world. They become her, or she becomes their whole world. So she in this one obviously is looking like a little angel with the halo. And she really cleverly depicted all 3 of these. One real quick thing I kind of forgot to go over to finish an embroidery. If we go to the back here, right, and just kind of loop through our needle through one of our stitches and then loop it through this creates just a really easy knot. I like to double knot. I always double knot just in case. Do that twice, loop through and pull, cut that off. And then our embroidery stays put, right? All right, so I'm gonna go back out of here into FaceTime and I'll show you just one more like set of student examples here, okay? So these are just really simple compilation of some student examples from my very first year teaching this. I haven't updated it in a while, so it looks a little funny, but that's okay. So this was about a move a girl had, right? So she showed the first house and the second house and represented that move through the kind of winding road that you see there. I thought this was really clever. It kind of really harkens back to that sort of Mekong River look in a lot of the story class we saw. Like I said, I'm the assistant professor of art education here. So most of my students who are coming through this particular class are soon to be teachers. And so she wanted to make one about her graduating, which would have been about a year after this class, after she had done her student teaching, so she could have something to hang in her classroom. This one was about one of my non-traditional students who had gotten married. And so she had gotten married and come back to complete her education degree. And so you can see how many different stitches that we have going on here and how she filled that and represented her wedding day. This one is about a girl's kind of inner self. So talking to her she kind of wanted to show her inner artist and kind of the way she kind of feels about herself inside, even though she is very shy and kind of demure in her actual outer appearance and personality. We got to see her representing her inner personality. This one is a subject a lot of us know and love. This is before and after coffee. So you can see here how she feels before coffee, which is pretty sad and dull. And it feels like, you know, we've got the kind of raindrops represented in those single stitches. Then she gets to the large cauldron of coffee and looks much happier and more energetic and brighter over here. This girl she was just struggling with what to do for this project. And so she said, I like to garden. Can I do the narrative of what a pumpkin goes through from seed to final pie? And so that is what she put in this one. This is another one where the student she had some previous ability in embroidery, so you can see that here, and was very adept at sewing. So she actually sewed the entire applique on the side that she put on here. A lot of the students finish it differently. If you use felt, you don't have to really worry about the sides because it's already a fairly finished looking piece. But for this one, you can see here that, again, she was representing a move from where she was to where she is and kind of the life events that happened along the way. And there was kind of the first group's representations. Oh, this is actually from a newer group too. So this one was about a girl whose mother kind of had to work every day, and so she was raised more by her sister than she was by her mother, and kind of the bond she made with her sister, which was really strong, but it also meant her bond with her mother wasn't quite so much. This one was a celebration of the family homestead that this student, I think was like 4th or 5th generation on this homestead. And so kind of a celebration of that place. I really like how she represented the dirt road kind of coming in there, the animals that they take care of and things like that. This one was completely abstracted. It was supposed to be kind of about her struggles with mental illness. She wanted to show how deep and dark it can get, but how she's growing through that issue and that problem, and making sure that like brighter days and beauty is still to come. And then of course the one you saw before. Another one that's kind of, a lot of these are about family once again. A lot of the students took it to heart when they were kind of seeing the images that the Hmong Story cloths had on them about kind of family and where they came from, and the scenes of life they were depicting. So a lot of these are scenes of life they are depicting. So this is a girl representing through kind of sewn objects, the different parts of her family. This is another one about a student struggling with mental illness, and actually the fact that she finally found a doctor she trusted when she came to the St. Cloud area to go to the university, got on the correct pills that were finally helping her, and she was able to really get some relief and feel like free for the first time. All right, so obviously, as I sort of mentioned, I'm a university professor, so these are students who are university students, but this is definitely something you could do at the secondary level. I don't see any reason why not to, like, no problem. That I don't think high schoolers would have any problem with this project whatsoever. So I think it'd be a great one to do at the high school level. Okay, so the rest of the time that we would have here would be for you to get started on your story cloth. Grab some fabric, grab either a hoop or some felt if you have felt handy, and go ahead and start to draw your story cloth narrative on here, and go ahead and get stitching with the 6 stitches you learned. I would encourage you to strongly to go and look at other stitches that are available. There's about a zillion out there on YouTube tutorials and things where you can make some really cool stuff. Every semester I have students find a new stitch and teach it to the rest of the class. And so you can see here, there's roses. This is a chevron stitch here. There's blanket stitches, and the lazy daisy, which is this one right here. These are really cute stitches, the chain stitch, the fishbone stitch, which is right here. All of these stitches, there's a ton out there that can just add some more unique qualities to your story cloth. But hopefully you can use those 6 stitches I showed you today and at least get started and get confident in your embroidery. All right, if you have any questions, go ahead and put them into the message board here in the portals that we have, and I hope you have a great conference. Bye.